The rain in New York did not wash away the filth. It only made the neon lights of the underground district look like bleeding wounds on the wet asphalt. I stood in the shadow of the velvet curtains, my hands trembling inside the pockets of my oversized, worn-out coat. The air inside the private lounge of the Obsidian Club smelled of expensive Cuban cigars, aged whiskey, and pure, suffocating fear. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, each beat echoing loudly in my ears. Across the room, sitting behind a massive desk of polished black mahogany, was the devil himself, Don Alessandro. He was the undisputed king of the city's criminal underworld, a man whose name was whispered like a death sentence in the dark alleys. His sharp, tailored suit clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, and his dark eyes were cold, calculating, and completely unreadable. To his left and right stood heavy-set men with scarred faces and hands resting casually on the grips of their holstered weapons. But it wasn't the guards or the guns that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the way Alessandro looked right through people, as if he could see the exact moment of their demise. Right next to me stood my mother and my stepfather, Richard. Their faces were flushed, covered in a greasy sweat born of desperation and greed. They didn't look at me as their daughter. They looked at me as a final, desperate lottery ticket. Richard stepped forward, his voice cracking as he held out a crumpled folder containing the receipts of his massive gambling debts to the Syndicate. "Please, Don Alessandro," Richard pleaded, his hand shaking so violently the papers rattled. "We don't have the $3 million, but we brought you an asset, something to cover the interest." Alessandro didn't move a single muscle. He didn't even blink. He just let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, filling the room until it became hard to breathe. My mother grabbed my arm, her long nails digging into my skin through the cheap fabric of my coat, pushing me forward into the harsh glow of the chandelier. "She can work for you," my mother whispered eagerly, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "She is strong. She can clean. She can cook. She can be whatever your men want her to be. Just wipe our slate clean." I felt a hot wave of shame wash over my face, my eyes burning with tears that I swore I would not let fall in front of these monsters. Before we reveal the one impossible question that changed my tragic fate forever, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single chapter of this dark romance, and leave a like to support the story. Let us dive deeper into the shadows, where love and vengeance collide. My entire life had been a masterclass in being invisible. A ghost walking through a world that only noticed me to point out my flaws. Growing up as a plus-size girl in a family obsessed with superficial perfection was its own special kind of hell. My mother spent her days staring into mirrors, starving herself, and counting calories, while Richard spent his nights burning through money at illegal poker tables. To them, my soft curves and heavy steps were a constant embarrassment, an eyesore in their perfectly curated, superficial world. "Look at you," Richard would sneer at the dinner table, tossing a plate of plain lettuce in front of me. "You take up too much space, Clara. The least you could do is make yourself useful." And so, I became their servant long before they ever brought me to the Mafia's doorstep. I worked 3 jobs, my feet blistering inside cheap shoes as I scrubbed floors, flipped burgers, and sorted inventory in freezing warehouses until midnight. Every single penny I earned went directly into Richard's hands, swallowed instantly by his endless debts and my mother's expensive addictions. I wore baggy, oversized men's hoodies and worn-out jeans, trying my best to shrink myself, to disappear into the background so I wouldn't have to face their cruel comments. "Nobody is ever going to look at a girl your size, Clara," my mother told me once, her voice dripping with pity as she adjusted her designer dress. "You need to work twice as hard just to make people tolerate your presence." I believed her. I really did. I accepted the exhaustion, the aching muscles, and the deep, hollow loneliness that settled into my bones every night as I slept on a thin mattress in the basement. I thought that if I just kept my head down, paid off their debts, and stayed out of the way, eventually I would earn a small piece of freedom. But greed is a monster that can never be satisfied. and my family's debts grew faster than I could ever work.
When the Syndicate finally sent their enforcers to our house, breaking Richard's fingers as a final warning, my family didn't hesitate for a single second. They didn't sell their house. They didn't sell their luxury car. They packed me into the back seat of their vehicle in the middle of the night, telling me we were going on a family trip, only to drag me into the lion's den. Now, standing in the center of the Don's luxurious office, the truth stripped away the last remnants of my naive heart. Richard stepped closer to Alessandro's desk, a sickening, desperate smile plastering his face as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "Look at her, Don Alessandro," Richard chuckled, a pathetic attempt to sound casual and charming. "She's a big girl, plenty of meat on her bones. She can handle the heaviest labor in your kitchens, or your men can use her for entertainment." My mother nodded eagerly in agreement, totally unbothered by the fact that she was selling her own flesh and blood into human trafficking. "Yes, she doesn't mind a little rough treatment," my mother added, her eyes gleaming with the hope of escaping her financial ruin. "She's used to being ignored anyway. Nobody will look for her. Nobody cares about a plus-size charity case." The words cut through me like shards of broken glass, tearing away at my dignity, exposing my deepest insecurities in front of a room full of dangerous men. The guards in the room shifted their weight, some of them smirking, their eyes scanning my body with dirty, predatory curiosity. I felt small. I felt naked. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. But as I looked down at my worn-out shoes, something deep inside my broken soul suddenly snapped. I was tired of hiding. I was tired of apologizing for simply existing, for taking up space in a world that didn't deserve my tears. I forced my shoulders back. I lifted my chin, locking my gaze directly onto the man sitting behind the desk. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Don Alessandro caught my gaze, and for a fraction of a second, something dark and intense flared in the depths of his pitch-black eyes. The smirk vanished from the faces of his guards as Alessandro slowly stood up from his leather chair, his imposing 6'4" frame towering over the room. The atmosphere instantly dropped by 20 degrees, the air becoming so thick it felt like breathing liquid lead. He didn't look at my parents. He kept his eyes locked onto mine, walking around the perimeter of the desk with the slow, predatory grace of a black panther. His footsteps were completely silent against the expensive Persian rug, yet each step felt like a thunderclap in the quiet room. He stopped just 2 feet away from me, smelling of rich leather, expensive cologne, and the faint, metallic scent of underlying danger. Alessandro's face was a mask of absolute, unyielding stone. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles leaped beneath his tanned skin. He looked down at me, his gaze tracing the lines of my face, noting the stubborn tilt of my chin, and then slowly sliding down to take in the full, soft curves of my body. There was no disgust in his eyes. There was no mockery. There was only a terrifying, burning intensity that made my skin tingle. Then he turned his head slowly toward my stepfather, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "You brought me your daughter," Alessandro murmured, the smoothness of his tone making it infinitely more terrifying than a loud scream. "To pay for your pathetic, cowardly mistakes." Richard swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. "Yes, Don Alessandro, she is yours. The debt is settled, right?" Alessandro slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek, heavy black pen and a piece of paper containing Richard's contract. With a swift, elegant motion, he signed his name across the bottom, officially wiping out the $3 million debt in a single stroke. My mother let out a loud gasp of pure relief, clutching her chest, while Richard practically laughed out loud, reaching out to take the paper. "Thank you, Don. Thank you," Richard cried, backing away toward the exit. "Come on, let's go before he changes his mind." "Stop," Alessandro commanded. The single word froze my parents in their tracks, their smiles instantly turning to ice. Alessandro didn't look at them. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on me,
his voice echoing through the silent room like a dark vow. "The debt is settled," Alessandro said softly, a brutal, merciless smile playing on his lips. "But the price for your disgusting existence has just gone up."
Alessandro turned his head slightly, giving a microscopic nod to the two massive enforcers standing by the heavy oak doors. "Take them to the basement," Alessandro ordered, his voice flat, completely devoid of any human emotion. "Break every bone in their hands, the same hands they used to drag this girl into my club." My mother screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that cut through the silence of the lounge as the guards grabbed her by her thin arms. Richard fell to his knees, his face turning an ash-gray color as he tried to crawl toward the desk, begging for mercy. "No! Don Alessandro, please! We gave you what you wanted," Richard shrieked, his polished shoes scuffing against the floor as the enforcers dragged him backward. "You gave me nothing," Alessandro replied coldly, not even looking down at the man sobbing on the floor. "You traded your own blood to cover your cowardice. In my world, family is sacred. Traitors are dealt with." The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off their pathetic pleas, leaving only the muffled sound of my mother's distant crying fading down the corridor. The silence returned to the office, heavier now, filled with the invisible weight of the violence that was about to unfold beneath our feet. I stood frozen in the exact same spot, my breath trembling, my eyes wide as I looked at the man who had just rewritten my entire existence with a single word. Alessandro walked back to his desk, but he didn't sit down. He picked up a crystal glass, poured 2 fingers of amber whiskey, and swallowed it in one slow gulp. Then, he turned around and leaned against the edge of the mahogany desk, crossing his powerful arms over his chest. "Are you going to cry for them, Clara?" he asked, his dark eyes boring into mine, searching for any sign of weakness or regret. I swallowed the lump of fear in my throat, forcing my voice to remain steady, refusing to let him see me break.
"No," I whispered, the word tasting like freedom on my tongue. "They stopped being my family the moment they put a price tag on my life." A slow, dangerous smile crept onto Alessandro's lips, a flash of genuine interest breaking through his stone-cold expression. "Good," he murmured, stepping away from the desk and walking closer to me until the heat radiating from his chest warmed my cold skin. "Because from this moment on, your old life is dead. You belong to the Syndicate. You belong to me." He reached out, his large, warm hand surprisingly gentle as his thumb brushed against my jawline, forcing me to keep my chin up. "Tomorrow, we test your loyalty," Alessandro whispered, his breath teasing my lips. "We will see if you have the soul of a survivor, or if you are just another victim." The next morning, I woke up in a room that was larger than the entire apartment I used to share with my parents. The bed was a massive fortress of dark silk and plush pillows, sitting in the center of a high-security bedroom on the top floor of Alessandro's private estate. Huge floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a sprawling estate, guarded by armed men and vicious attack dogs patrolling the perimeter walls. I sat up, pulling the heavy silk sheet around my shoulders, looking at the clean, expensive clothes left for me on a nearby velvet armchair. There were no baggy hoodies, no worn-out jeans, and no rags meant to hide my body from the world. Instead, a simple but elegant black dress made of heavy, body-hugging knit fabric was waiting for me, alongside a pair of brand-new leather boots. I dressed slowly, my hands shaking as the fabric clung tightly to the curves of my hips and the fullness of my chest, accentuating everything I had spent a lifetime trying to conceal. Before I could fully process my new reality, a quiet knock echoed through the room, and a tall, elderly butler entered, bowing respectfully. "Miss Clara, the Don is waiting for you in the conservatory," the man said, his tone perfectly polite, treating me like a royal guest rather than a captive servant. I followed him down endless marble corridors, passing priceless paintings and security cameras that tracked my every movement until we reached a glass-roofed room filled with exotic plants. Alessandro was sitting at a small wrought iron table, reading through a stack of intelligence reports while sipping dark espresso. He looked up as I entered, his eyes immediately dropping to the way the black dress hugged my waist and flowed over my wide hips. The air grew thick again, that familiar, intoxicating tension returning to the space between us as he gestured for me to sit opposite him. "Did you sleep well, Clara?"
he asked, closing his folder and signaling the butler to pour me a cup of tea. "I slept," I answered honestly, keeping my hands folded in my lap. "But I want to know what my duties are. I don't like being idle." Alessandro chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated deep in his chest. "You spent your whole life working yourself to the bone for people who hated you. You think I brought you here to clean my floors? Then why am I here?" I demanded, my voice growing bolder. "You paid $3 million for me. You must want something." Alessandro leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, bringing his face so close I could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes. "I want to see if you can look the devil in the eye and not blink," he said softly. "Today, we find out where your loyalty lies." He opened the folder on the table, sliding a single photograph across the polished surface toward me. It was a picture of a young, handsome man with a cruel smile, sitting in a luxury sports car. "That is Marcus," Alessandro explained, his voice turning ice cold. "He is the son of my biggest rival, the head of the Lombardi family, and he has been looking for a way to destroy me for months." I looked at the photo, then back up at Alessandro, my heart rate beginning to accelerate. "What does he have to do with me?" "Marcus knows your parents sold you to me," Alessandro said, his eyes tracking my expression. "He thinks you are a weak, broken girl who wants revenge on the man who locked her family in a basement." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, encrypted burner phone and sliding it across the table next to the photograph. "Marcus managed to get this phone into my house through a compromised maid this morning," Alessandro continued, his gaze unwavering. "He wants you to call him. He wants to offer you freedom, money, and a way out, in exchange for the security codes to my mansion." My breath caught in my throat as I looked down at the sleek black phone resting on the iron table. This was the test, the ultimate ultimatum. "If I take the phone and call him," I whispered, my eyes locked on Alessandro's face, "what happens to me?" Alessandro didn't move. His expression remained an absolute mask of stone, but his hand slowly moved to the inside of his jacket, where the grip of his pistol was hidden. "If you choose him, you choose death," Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal whisper. "If you choose me, you give me your soul. Now tell me, Clara, who do you belong to?" The silence stretched between us, so thick and heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I looked down at the black burner phone resting on the cold wrought iron table, its sleek surface reflecting the gray sky above the glass roof. I knew that a single wrong move, a single flicker of hesitation in my eyes, would mean the end of my life right here in this beautiful, sterile garden. Alessandro's hand remained hidden inside his jacket, his fingers undoubtedly wrapped around the cold steel of his weapon, waiting for my choice. He wasn't just a man, he was the law in this city, a king who didn't tolerate treason, and I was nothing but a girl whose own blood had traded her for a clean slate. Marcus Lombardi was offering me a way out, a chance to run away, to slide back into the shadows of the ordinary world where nobody knew my name or my shame. But I remembered the way Marcus's father had smiled in the rumors I heard on the streets, and I knew that to men like him, a girl like me was just a temporary tool to be used and discarded. More than that, I looked at Alessandro, at the dark intensity in his eyes, the strange, terrifying respect he had shown me, and the brutal justice he had delivered to the people who had tortured my soul for years. Without breaking eye contact, I reached out my hand, my fingers steady, and picked up the heavy burner phone from the table. Alessandro's jaw tightened, a dangerous, lethal spark flaring in his pitch-black eyes as he watched my movement, his muscles shifting beneath his tailored suit. I didn't dial the number. I didn't look at the screen. Instead, I dropped the phone onto the marble floor
and brought the heavy heel of my new leather boot down onto it with all the force and weight of my body. The plastic cracked, the screen shattered into a web of silver lines, and the delicate electronic components inside crunched into useless dust beneath my foot.
I ground my heel into the remains until the phone was completely obliterated. Then I looked back up at the dawn, my breathing calm, my chin lifted high. "I don't swap one master for another," I said, my voice ringing out clearly through the quiet conservatory. "Marcus Lombardi wants a weapon against you. You want my loyalty. I choose the man who broke the hands of my tormentors." For a long, agonizing moment, Alessandro just stared at me, his face an unreadable mask of pure stone, his eyes tracking the stubborn rise and fall of my chest. Then, slowly, his hand slid out from the inside of his jacket, completely empty, and a low, dark chuckle vibrated from the deep recesses of his chest. He stood up, walking around the table until he was standing directly over me, his massive shadow completely engulfing my frame, yet I didn't flinch. He reached down, his large, warm hand gripping the back of my neck, his thumb resting right against the racing pulse at the base of my throat. "You have a spine of steel, Clara," he murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate whisper that sent a wave of heat straight down my spine. "Most men double your size would have begged for that phone. You broke it without a second thought." "I told you," I whispered back, my eyes locking onto his with unwavering intensity. "My old life is dead. I have nothing left to lose." "You are wrong," Alessandro said softly, his thumb caressing the soft skin of my neck, his gaze dropping to the full, heavy curve of my lips. "You have everything to gain. From this day forward, nobody touches you. Nobody speaks your name without bowing their head." By the next week, the reality of my new life began to settle in, changing everything I thought I knew about myself and the world. Alessandro didn't hide me away in the dark corners of his mansion like a shameful secret or a common servant.
He brought me into his world with a fierce, possessive intensity that bordered on absolute obsession, completely obliterating every debt and trace of my past. He hired the city's most elite accountants to trace every single business, every single loan, and every single cent my stepfather had ever touched, buying them out and burning the contracts. But the true shift happened when a team of high-end fashion designers and stylists arrived at the estate, sent by Alessandro to completely replace my wardrobe. I stood in the center of the grand dressing room, surrounded by racks of expensive silks, satins, and velvets, feeling smaller than ever as the head designer looked at me. The designer, a thin, sharp-faced woman with judgmental eyes, scanned my plush waist, my wide hips, and the heavy fullness of my thighs with a visible sneer. "We will need to order special shapewear," the woman whispered to her assistant, loud enough for me to hear.
"And we should focus on loose, dark draping fabrics to minimize the excess, to hide the imperfections." The familiar cold blade of shame pierced my chest, and I instinctively reached for the baggy sleeves of my old sweater, wanting to shrink into nothingness. "Get out," a voice boomed from the doorway, cold as a winter storm and heavy with lethal authority. Alessandro stood there, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his dark eyes fixed on the designer with a look that could have stripped the paint off the walls. The designer turned pale, dropping her measuring tape as she began to stammer an apology. "Don Alessandro, I was just saying we need to find styles that are flattering." "I paid you to dress a queen, not to hide a treasure," Alessandro interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that made the assistant tremble. "You look at her and see imperfections. I look at her and see perfection. Every single curve, every single inch of her is a masterpiece." He stepped into the room, walking past the terrified stylists until he stood right in front of me, his large hands reaching out to gently take my hands away from my body. "You will leave my sight immediately," Alessandro ordered the designers, not even looking back at them. "And you will send me people who know how to celebrate a woman who looks like a goddess, not a ghost." The designers practically ran out of the room, slamming the double doors behind them, leaving the two of us alone in the quiet, luxurious space.
Alessandro lifted my hands, kissing the knuckles of each hand with a slow, deliberate reverence that made my breath catch in my throat. "Never try to hide yourself from me, Clara," he murmured, his eyes burning with a possessive fire that left no room for doubt. "Your body is not something to be concealed. It is something to be worshipped."
The next day, a different team arrived, and under Alessandro's direct supervision, they created dresses that I had never even dared to dream of wearing. They used heavy emerald velvet that clung to the sweeping line of my hips, deep crimson silk that accentuated the lush fullness of my chest, and tailored gold fabrics that celebrated my waist. For the first time in my entire life, when I looked into the full-length mirror, I didn't see a girl who took up too much space. I saw a woman of immense power, a woman whose beauty was undeniable, radiant, and fiercely protected by the most dangerous man in the city. Every evening, Alessandro would have dinner with me, watching me eat with a dark satisfaction, ensuring that I never felt the need to starve myself or apologize for my appetite again. He protected me from the whispers of his own men, shooting down any guard who dared to look at me with anything less than absolute shaking respect. But the peace of our private sanctuary was nothing more than the calm before a massive, bloody storm, and the Lombardi family was still watching from the shadows. The storm broke on a Thursday evening, when the sky over the city was the color of a bruised iris. Alessandro had been called away to an emergency meeting with the commission, leaving me under the heavy guard of his most trusted men at the estate. I was sitting in the library, wearing a new emerald green silk dress that pooled around my calves, reading a book, when the alarms began to wail. The high-pitched screech tore through the quiet house, followed immediately by the dull, heavy thuds of suppressed gunfire echoing from the front courtyard. Before I could even stand up, the heavy oak doors of the library burst open, and 3 masked men in tactical gear stormed into the room. Our guards fought brutally, but they were outnumbered, and within seconds, a heavy hand slammed against my mouth, cutting off my breath. "Don't make a sound, big girl," a rough voice whispered in my ear as a thick zip tie was violently secured around my wrist behind my back. They dragged me out through the service tunnels, shoving me into the back of a black armored van that sped away into the rainy night. An hour later, I was pushed into a freezing, abandoned warehouse down by the docks, the smell of rotting wood and salt water filling my nose. Sitting on a rusted metal chair in the center of the room was Marcus Lombardi, the man from the photograph, tossing a silver lighter between his hands. He looked at me as I was forced onto my knees in front of him, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his pale, sharp face. "So, this is Alessandro's new little obsession," Marcus sneered, leaning forward and using the tip of his leather shoe to lift my chin up. "I expected a supermodel, not a heavy piece of baggage from the slums." I bit my lip, refusing to show him the satisfaction of a tear, keeping my spine perfectly straight despite the cold concrete biting into my knees. "Alessandro killed my men and took my territory because of his arrogance," Marcus hissed, his eyes narrowing to slits. "And now, you are going to help me destroy him." He pulled out a satellite phone, tossing it onto the floor in front of me, its small screen glowing with a pre-dialed number. "You are going to call him, Clara," Marcus ordered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You will tell him you escaped, and that he needs to meet you at the old pier alone. If you do it, I let you live. If you don't, my men will discard you in the river." I looked down at the phone, then looked up into Marcus's eyes, a cold, mocking smile forming on my own lips. "You really don't know anything about him, do you?" I said softly, my voice completely devoid of fear. "And you certainly don't know anything about me." Marcus frowned, his anger flaring. "What did you say?" "I told you once before through his actions, and I will say it to your face now," I whispered, leaning forward. "I don't betray the man who saved my soul. Kill me if you want, but Alessandro will burn your entire empire to ash for this." Marcus raised his hand, his face twisting with rage as he prepared to strike me across the face for my defiance. But he never got the chance. The massive iron doors of the warehouse didn't just open, they were blown off their hinges with a deafening, thunderous explosion that shook the entire structure. The concrete floor trembled as a dozen flashbangs illuminated the dark space, followed instantly by the terrifying rhythmic roar of automatic weapon fire. Marcus's men didn't even have time to raise their weapons before they were systematically dropped by the elite tactical unit pouring into the building. And walking through the smoke and fire, completely unbothered by the chaos around him, was Don Alessandro. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up, and his hands were covered in the blood of the men who had stood in his way outside. His eyes were no longer dark. They were completely pitch black, filled with a primal, demonic fury that made even Marcus's remaining guards drop their guns in terror. Alessandro didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the bodies on the floor. His eyes locked onto me, scanning my body for any signs of injury. When he saw the zip ties on my wrists and the faint red mark where the guard had grabbed my jaw, a low, terrifying growl escaped his throat. "Alessandro, wait!" Marcus shrieked, backing away until his knees hit his chair, pulling a small pistol from his waist and pointing it wildly. Alessandro didn't stop. He walked forward with an unstoppable, heavy grace, each step echoing like a death knell in the cavernous warehouse. Marcus fired a shot, but his hands were shaking so violently the bullet went wide, embedding itself harmlessly into a distant wooden crate. In a fraction of a second, Alessandro closed the distance, his large hands snapping out like a steel trap, grabbing Marcus by the throat and lifting him entirely off the ground. The pistol clattered to the floor as Marcus choked, his legs kicking uselessly in the air as Alessandro squeezed, his forearm muscles bulging with lethal power. "You dared to touch what is mine," Alessandro whispered, his voice so low and gravelly it sounded like grinding stones. "You thought you could use her to get to me, but she is the only reason you are still breathing for these few seconds." With a brutal, effortless motion, Alessandro slammed Marcus down onto the concrete floor, pinning him with a heavy boot directly over his chest. He reached into his back pocket, pulling out a heavy, silver-plated blade that caught the faint light of the warehouse fires. "No. Please," Marcus gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth as he looked up at the devil standing over him. Alessandro didn't hesitate. With two swift, precise strokes, he severed the tendons in Marcus's hands, ensuring the man would never be able to hold a weapon or a phone again. Marcus shrieked in agony, the sound bouncing off the walls, but Alessandro simply turned his back on him, completely finished with the pathetic creature. He walked over to me, kneeling down on the dirty concrete without a single thought for his expensive clothes, and pulled a pocket knife to slice through my restraints. The moment my hands were free, he didn't pull away. He gathered me into his massive arms, crushing my plush body against his chest with a desperate, possessive strength. "I am sorry I was late, Mia Regina," he murmured into my hair, his chest heaving as he held me as if I were the only stable thing left in a burning world. "You weren't late," I whispered, burying my face into his neck, soaking in the scent of his cologne and the warmth of his skin. "I knew you would come." The following night, the grand ballroom of the Syndicate's main headquarters was filled with the city's most powerful, dangerous, and elite figures. Hundreds of capos, politicians, and rival family heads dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns stood beneath the massive crystal chandeliers, whispering about the total annihilation of the Lombardi family. The whispers stopped instantly as the heavy double doors at the top of the grand marble staircase swung open. Alessandro stood there, looking like an absolute emperor in a midnight black tuxedo. But he wasn't looking at the crowd. He turned, offering his arm to me as I stepped into the light, wearing a custom-made, breathtaking gown of pure gold satin. The fabric hugged every single curve of my wide hips, the fullness of my chest, and the soft sweep of my waist, shimmering like liquid fire with every step I took. I didn't hide my body. I didn't look down. I held my head high, my hand resting firmly on the arm of the man who ruled the city. As we walked down the grand staircase together, the elite society of the underworld parted like the Red Sea, their faces filled with absolute, shaking awe. Alessandro led me to the center of the raised stage at the front of the ballroom, raising his glass of champagne to command the attention of the entire room. "Listen to me carefully,"
Alessandro's voice boomed, echoing with absolute authority through the silent hall. For a long time, people have asked who would share my throne, who would hold the keys to the Syndicate. He turned to me, his dark eyes melting with a warmth and devotion that he had never shown to any other living soul, taking my hand in his. "This is Clara," Alessandro announced proudly, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "She is not a secret. She is not a shadow. She is my queen. Anyone who looks at her with disrespect, anyone who dares to whisper against her, will answer to my blade." A deep, respectful bow rippled through the entire crowd as hundreds of dangerous men and elegant women bent their knees to us, acknowledging my new, unyielding power. I looked out over the sea of people who would have ignored me just weeks ago, feeling the immense weight of the gold ring Alessandro had just slipped onto my finger. I was no longer the invisible plus-size girl sold to pay a pathetic debt. I was the woman who had conquered the heart of the devil himself. Would you have the courage to break the phone and give your soul to the devil to protect your dignity, just like Clara did? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what you would do in her place.